It was supposed to be a quiet morning inside the Manhattan District Court. Cameras lined the hallways. Reporters whispered about yet another high-profile hearing, but no one expected what was about to unfold. Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, dressed in a simple cream suit, had come not as a politician, but as a citizen. She was there to support a community activist facing charges after leading a peaceful protest against housing discrimination. She sat quietly in the gallery, taking notes, occasionally whispering to the defendant's lawyer. When the judge called a short recess, Aok stood to ask a procedural question, something minor, polite, and well within her rights as a public representative. But one police officer, standing near the aisle, didn't like her tone. "Ma'am, sit down," he ordered sharply. Alexandria turned to him, composed as always. "Officer, I'm simply asking for clarification on the record," the officer interrupted, voice rising. "I said sit down." The entire courtroom froze. People exchanged uneasy glances. Cameras turned. Aok raised her hand slightly, showing she meant no threat. "Sir, please don't raise your voice." Before she could finish, the officer stepped forward and slapped her across the face. Gasps erupted from every corner of the courtroom. The sound echoed like a thunderclap. Sharp, shocking, final. For a moment, there was silence. Total, chilling silence. Then chaos exploded. Journalists shouted. Supporters screamed. Some tried to rush toward her, but security blocked the aisles. The judge pounded his gavel, yelling for order. Aok didn't cry, didn't shout. She simply stood there, one hand on her cheek, eyes steady, voice calm. "Did you just strike a sitting member of Congress?" she asked quietly. The officer froze, realizing what he'd done. His face turned pale. Her calmness was disarming. Power shifted in that instant, not by force, but by composure. And as cameras rolled, the crowd realized this moment would not just be replayed on the news. It would rewrite the narrative of power and justice itself. What happened just seconds later left everyone in that courtroom speechless. The sound of that slap still echoed through the marble walls of the Manhattan District Court. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. It felt as if time itself had stopped. Then, like a dam bursting, the room erupted into chaos. Journalists screamed for their cameramen to record. Protesters in the back rows jumped to their feet, shouting, "Assault! That's assault!" Others cried, "She's a congresswoman." Security officers rushed forward, forming a barrier around Aok, their earpieces buzzing with frantic orders. The officer who struck her, Officer Harlan, stood frozen, his palm trembling, eyes darting around as he realized what he had done. Aok slowly lowered her hand from her cheek. There was a faint red mark across her face, but her expression remained calm, almost serene. She didn't shout. She didn't retaliate. She simply said, voice low but steady, "Everyone deserves to be safe even in a courtroom." The crowd grew louder. The presiding judge slammed his gavel again and again. "Order, order," he roared, his voice breaking through the noise, but the chaos refused to die down. Aok turned to her aide, whispering, "Get the Capitol's legal office on the line. Right now." Within minutes, word had spread. Outside, reporters were already broadcasting live updates. Breaking news from Manhattan: a police officer has allegedly struck Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez inside a courtroom. Inside, the judge called for a recess, his hands shaking slightly as he spoke. "Everyone, calm down. We'll address this immediately." But Aok didn't leave the room. She stayed right where she was, standing tall. "No, Your Honor," she said, voice ringing with quiet authority. "We don't pause justice when injustice happens right in front of us." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge hesitated, clearly torn. The officer was still standing by the bench, staring at the floor. Another guard gently took his arm to lead him away. But the damage was already done, and every camera had caught it. Reporters outside began pushing through the doors, microphones ready, demanding answers. But Aok ignored them all. She turned to the defendant, the community activist she'd come to support, and gave a reassuring nod. "This isn't just about me," she whispered to him. "It's about every voice that's been silenced by power." Meanwhile, a senior prosecutor approached her nervously. "Congresswoman, please, let us handle this quietly. We can file a formal complaint." Aok cut him off gently. "Quietly is how things like this keep happening." Her words carried like thunder. Every journalist in the room scribbled them down. Within an hour, hashtags were trending. Hashtag Justice FO Rousey. Hashtag Accountability Now. #noon above the law. Clips of the slap were already circulating on social media, viewed millions of times, but while the internet was exploding, Ayok stayed calm inside that courtroom. She refused medical attention, saying softly, "There are bigger wounds here than mine." The judge, trying to regain order, called her forward. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, the court regrets this incident. We will handle the officer internally." Ayok looked him straight in the eye. "Respectfully, Your Honor," she said, "what happened here isn't just about one officer. It's about a system that lets authority strike before listening. We can't call this justice if silence is the verdict." Even the judge fell silent. She turned toward the gallery, speaking not just to the room, but to the nation watching through every screen. "The law should protect the powerless, not empower the cruel. I will not sit down. Not now." The room erupted in applause, hesitant at first, then thunderous. The defendant, still handcuffed, began to cry quietly. Ayok walked toward the exit, her steps steady, the cameras following her every move. As she reached the doorway, she turned one last time. "Your Honor," she said, "I'll be back when this court is ready to listen, not when it's ready to silence." Then she walked outside. Reporters swarmed her with microphones. "Congresswoman, do you plan to press charges?" one shouted. Ayok paused, glanced back at the courthouse behind her, and said simply, "I plan to demand accountability, not revenge." Her staff escorted her to the steps, where dozens of supporters had gathered, holding signs that read "Justice, not fear." The crowd chanted her name, their voices echoing down the streets, and somewhere in the middle of it all, the very officer who'd struck her watched from a side window, face pale, hand trembling, realizing the world had just changed. Have you ever seen power abused right in front of you? Tell us in the comments, and don't forget to mention your country or city. Let's see where justice still has a voice. By the next morning, the video had already crossed 50 million views. Every major news outlet replayed the moment the officer struck her, slowed down, analyzed, debated. Some called it a national disgrace, others, especially certain pundits, tried to twist it, accusing her of provoking the situation or staging it for attention. Inside government circles, chaos brewed. The police union released a statement defending Officer Harlan, claiming he had acted in the interest of courtroom order. Social media was split. Supporters rallied behind Ayok with the #StandWithAlexandria, while her critics flooded the internet with hate. But in the middle of the storm, Ayok stayed silent. No tweets, no press conference, just quiet, focus. Her chief of staff, Rina, rushed into her office that morning with stacks of papers. "They're trying to spin this, Alexandria. They're painting you as confrontational. We need to respond, fast." Ayok looked up from her desk, sipping coffee, her expression calm. "They're scared," she said softly. "When people in power are afraid of accountability, they always attack the truth first." Rina frowned. "So what's the plan?" Ayok stood, walked toward the window overlooking the city, and said, "We don't fight noise with noise. We fight lies with law." Within hours, she called a press conference not outside the courthouse, but inside the Capitol building, the same place where laws are written and justice is supposed to live. When she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Cameras flashed, microphones pointed, and reporters leaned in. "Yesterday," she began, "an officer of the law struck a member of Congress on camera inside a courtroom. But the real story isn't the slap. The real story is what it revealed. A system that silences before it listens, that punishes before it understands." Every word hit like a hammer. "This is not about me. It's about every citizen who's ever been disrespected, dismissed, or disbelieved simply because someone in authority decided their voice didn't matter." The room broke into applause, but behind closed doors, the backlash was already forming. High-ranking officials contacted her team privately, warning her to de-escalate. One even said, "Alexandria, you're making enemies in the wrong places." Ayok didn't flinch. "If the wrong places fear the truth," she said, "then I'm in the right one." Meanwhile, the Manhattan court quietly announced that Officer Harlan had been placed on temporary administrative leave, a slap on the wrist ironic and infuriating. The next morning, Ayok received a confidential call from a senior legal committee member. "Congresswoman," the voice said, "the judge who oversaw that hearing has requested a review. They want your written testimony." She smiled faintly. "Good, I'll give them more than that." A week later, Ayok returned to the courthouse, this time, not as a bystander, but as an advocate. Protesters lined the steps, chanting her name. Cameras flashed from every angle. Inside, the energy was tense. The same judge from before sat nervously at the bench. The media pit was packed, and across the room sat Officer Harlan's suit pressed, face pale, eyes avoiding hers. When the judge began the proceedings, Ayok rose and asked to speak. The courtroom went silent. Permission granted, the judge said quietly. Ayok stepped forward, her voice steady. I'm not here to demand revenge. I'm here to demand accountability. Because when an officer can strike an elected representative in a court of law and walk away with paid leave, what does that say to the people watching? She turned toward the gallery, where dozens of ordinary citizens sat listening, recording, hoping. Justice is not about titles. It's about truth. And if truth can't stand in this room, then no one's safe outside of it. Her words hit the courtroom like a wave. Even the judge looked shaken. She ended her statement simply. This moment is bigger than one man's mistake. It's about the kind of nation we want to be, one that protects power or one that protects people. The crowd erupted in applause. Some stood, others cried. As the judge called for order, Ayok sat down, folding her hands calmly. She didn't need to shout anymore. The truth was echoing loud enough for everyone to hear. Outside, reporters rushed to get statements, and the story trended again. But this time, something had changed. People weren't just talking about the slap, they were talking about justice, abuse of power, and how calm strength can turn humiliation into history. What would you do if someone in authority humiliated you in public? Would you stay silent, or stand your ground like Ayok did? Tell me in the comments. The courthouse in Lower Manhattan had never seen so many people. Protesters, reporters, legal observers, even politicians crowded the steps. The story of the courtroom slap had grown into something larger, a symbol of how fragile respect for justice had become. Inside, tension buzzed through the air like static. The disciplinary hearing for Officer Harlan was about to begin. It wasn't just a routine review, it was being televised nationwide. For the first time in years, millions were about to witness what true accountability might look like. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez walked in quietly, no entourage, no grand gestures, just focus. Her simple black suit contrasted the noise around her. She carried only a notebook, the same one she'd brought the day she was struck. Every camera turned as she took her seat in the front row. Officer Harlan sat at the defense table, hands clasped, eyes locked on the floor. The presiding judge, an older man with silver hair, adjusted his glasses. Before we begin, he said, this hearing is of extraordinary public interest. The goal is not spectacle, but transparency. He looked at Ayok. Congresswoman, given your role as both witness and public servant, the review committee has requested your participation in today's proceeding not as a complainant, but as a temporary ethics chair. Gasps rippled through the room. Ayok blinked, unsure if she heard correctly. I'm sorry, Your Honor. You want me to preside? The judge nodded. Yes, you've demonstrated composure under pressure, something this courtroom could use today. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some clapped softly. Others whispered in disbelief. Ayok hesitated for a moment, then stood. If the goal is justice, she said, I'll do it. A court officer stepped forward, guiding her toward the raised platform. And just like that, the same woman who had been humiliated in this room now took the judge's seat. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Cameras zoomed in as she adjusted the microphone and opened her notebook. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The same authority that once silenced her was now hers to command. Not through anger, but through moral clarity. Ayok began the session with a deep breath. Good morning, she said evenly. Today is not about revenge. It's about restoring respect for the law, for the public, and for the people who serve it. She turned toward Officer Harlan. Officer, you've been accused of misconduct in this courtroom. Before we proceed, do you have anything you wish to say? Harlan's lawyer whispered frantically, but the officer shook his head. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke. I made a mistake. I was following protocol. She stood without permission. I overreacted. Ayok nodded. You overreacted to a question, not a threat. Tell me, is there a protocol for striking someone who disagrees with you? The officer looked down, unable to answer. She continued, her voice calm but piercing. Power is not measured by how loud you shout or how strong you strike. It's measured by how fairly you treat those you could hurt. The courtroom was silent. Even the air felt heavy. Ayok leaned forward slightly. You wear a badge. That badge represents every citizen's trust. When you raised your hand against me, you didn't just disrespect me, you disrespected the very system you swore to protect. Harlan swallowed hard. I know, I'm sorry. Ayok paused, studying him. Apologies are the beginning of change, not the end. But you must understand something. Accountability doesn't destroy trust. It rebuilds it. A woman in the audience began clapping softly. Others joined. The sound filled the courtroom, not as noise, but as unity. After several minutes, Ayok brought the gavel down gently. The ethics committee will deliberate, she said. This hearing is adjourned until the final decision is announced. She stood to leave, but the judge now seated beside her leaned in and whispered, You handled that better than most judges I've known. A faint smile crossed her face. Justice isn't about titles, she said. It's about balance. As she stepped down from the platform, the cameras followed her every move. A reporter whispered to another. She didn't just take the judge's seat. She reclaimed the meaning of it. Outside, the crowd erupted when she appeared at the courthouse steps. Someone shouted, How does it feel to be in charge now? Ayok stopped, looked straight into the cameras and said, It's not about being in charge. It's about being in control of yourself, even when others lose control of theirs. The crowd roared in approval. And as she walked away, the headlines were already being written. From victim to voice, Ayok turns humiliation into history. What do you think justice really means, punishment or accountability? Tell us your thoughts below, and share your city or country. Let's see where people still believe in fairness. The next day, the world was still buzzing. Clips of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sitting in the judge's seat were everywhere. News broadcasts, podcasts, late-night shows. Some called it the greatest moment of poetic justice ever caught on camera. Others claimed it was a political stunt. But while the internet debated, Ayok was already back at work, not in front of cameras this time, but behind closed doors, in a conference room surrounded by documents, reports, and testimonies. Rina, her chief of staff, entered the room with two coffee cups and a weary look. You're trending in 68 countries, she said, setting one cup down. Half the world thinks you're a hero. The other half says you embarrass law enforcement. Ayok didn't look up from her papers. If the truth embarrasses power, she said calmly, then power needs to be embarrassed more often. Rina smiled faintly. You sound like a quote that'll be printed on protest signs. Ayok glanced up. Good. Let's make sure it's also printed in law books. That afternoon, the ethics committee reconvened, but this time, Ayok wasn't there as a temporary chair. She was there as a questioner. Her role, to cross-examine not only Officer Harlan, but also the system that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The hearing room was smaller than the main courtroom, but just as crowded. Dozens of reporters filled the back row, their cameras ready. When her turn came, Ayok stood, holding a thin folder. Her voice was steady, deliberate. Officer Harlan, she began, you've admitted to striking me, but your report says you felt threatened by aggressive questioning. Tell me, what about a question threatens you? Harlan shifted uncomfortably. It was tense. I was under pressure. Ayok nodded slowly. You were under pressure. In a courtroom, where questions are literally the purpose of being there. Laughter rippled through the crowd. But Ayok's expression remained serious. Pressure doesn't excuse violence, she continued. Because if we excuse it for you, then we excuse it for every officer who loses control in the streets, and that's how justice dies. The committee chair leaned forward. Congresswoman, are you implying this incident reflects a broader issue? Ayok turned to him. I'm not implying it. I'm proving it. She opened her folder and slid several documents across the table. These are complaints filed against officers in this department for excessive force, most dismissed without investigation. Pattern after pattern after pattern. Gasps filled the room. The committee chair adjusted his tie, visibly sweating. Accountability isn't anti-police, Ayok said. It's pro-truth. And truth is what keeps good officers safe and bad ones exposed. Officer Harlan stared at her, not with anger now, but with something closer to regret. I didn't mean for it to get this far, he murmured. Ayok nodded softly. That's what happens when systems protect silence instead of honesty. You thought you could act without consequence, because too many before you did. The silence that followed was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of reflection. After hours of questioning, the committee announced a short break. Reporters rushed outside, sending updates across the world. One headline read, Ayok turns disciplinary hearing into nationwide call for reform. Another, power needs to be embarrassed. Ayok's words shake the justice system. Back inside, Ayok sat quietly, her fingers pressed together. She wasn't celebrating. She knew this was only the beginning. Rena leaned over. You just dismantled an entire culture of cover-ups on live TV. How do you feel? Aok sighed. Tired, angry, but hopeful. Because people are finally seeing what silence looks like. Rena nodded slowly. You think they'll actually change anything? Aok smiled faintly. Change never starts from comfort. It starts from discomfort. From moments like this, when the hearing resumed, the committee chair cleared his throat. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, he said, we thank you for your testimony and your insight. We will review these materials and issue a formal decision. Aok stood, gathered her notes, and said simply, just remember justice isn't paperwork. It's people. The crowd erupted in applause once again. As she walked out of the building, dozens of citizens, young, old, of every background, waited behind the barricades, cheering her name. A teenage girl held up a handwritten sign that said, if she can stand up in court, I can stand up anywhere. Aok smiled and waved, stopping briefly to say to a reporter, the fight isn't against officers. It's against the idea that some people deserve respect more than others. That's the mindset we're changing. The sun was setting behind the courthouse as she walked down the steps. The golden light framed her silhouette, calm, unshaken, and resolute. She didn't just survive injustice. She turned it into a mirror and forced the entire nation to look. If you were in Aok's place, would you forgive or fight for reform? Comment below and tell us your country, because justice has no borders. 3 days later, the city held its breath. The ethics committee was set to announce its decision. The same courthouse that had once echoed with chaos was now surrounded by barricades, cameras, and a sea of protesters. Signs read, justice for all, power with accountability. No one above the law. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy, part courtroom, part history lesson. The panel of officials took their seats. At the center table sat Officer Harlan, eyes hollow. Across the aisle, Aok arrived quietly. No entourage, no press team, just her notebook again. Reporters whispered as she walked in. Someone muttered, there she is, the woman who changed the system just by standing up. The lead committee member cleared his throat. This session will now come to order. A hush fell. After thorough review of testimony, evidence, and prior records, the committee finds Officer Harlan guilty of professional misconduct and abuse of authority. Effective immediately, he is dismissed from service and barred from future employment in law enforcement. Gasps filled the room. Harlan's lawyer jumped up. Objection. This is excessive. The chair cut him off. Order. The gavel struck, echoing like thunder. And then, unexpectedly, the chair continued. Furthermore, this committee recommends a full federal inquiry into courtroom conduct and officer accountability standards. That line changed everything. The room erupted, half in applause, half in disbelief. For the first time in decades, a public officer had faced real consequences for misconduct inside the justice system itself. Aok didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply closed her notebook, took a breath, and looked across the aisle at the man who had once slapped her in front of the world. Their eyes met. Harlan looked broken, no longer defiant, just remorseful. He stood slowly. Congresswoman, he said hoarsely, I can't take back what I did. I was wrong. You didn't deserve that. None of this. None of it should have happened. Aok held his gaze for a long moment. Then she spoke softly. Change doesn't begin when we're perfect. It begins when we admit we're wrong. The room went silent again. She turned to the committee. Justice was done today not because a man was punished, but because a system was challenged. And I hope this becomes a standard, not an exception. Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with people chanting her name. Reporters pushed forward, shoving microphones in her direction. Congresswoman, how do you feel about the verdict? Aok paused, looking out at the massive crowd. This isn't victory. It's a beginning, she said. Because justice doesn't end with one case, it begins when we refuse to ignore the next one. Cameras flashed. The crowd cheered. Her words spread across every platform within hours. Clips of her standing before the committee flooded social media with captions like, Dignity wins. She took the seat and changed the story. In classrooms, teachers replayed her speech as a lesson in courage. In precincts, officers watched in uneasy silence. In homes across America, people saw maybe for the first time that power could be held accountable without violence. That evening, Aok returned to her office. The lights were dim, the city skyline glowing through the window. Rena sat across from her, scrolling through messages. You just got invited to speak at the United Nations Human Rights Forum, Rena said with a grin. Ayok chuckled. Guess I should start writing another speech. Rena leaned back. You realize what happened today, right? You didn't just make history. You changed it. Ayok looked out the window, quiet for a long moment. Then she said, history doesn't change when one person speaks. It changes when everyone starts listening. Hours later, as the city slept, a small clip of her courtroom words resurfaced online the moment she said, power is not measured by how loud you shout, but by how fairly you treat those you could hurt. That clip hit 200 million views overnight. Comments poured in from every corner of the world. Watching from Kenya, this is real leadership. From Manila, respect and strength personified. Brazil stands with you, Ayok. India is proud of women like her. Truth has no borders. Ayok read a few before closing her laptop. Her eyes were tired, but her heart was full. In that moment, she understood something powerful. The slap that was meant to silence her had echoed into something far greater. A conversation the world could no longer ignore. Would you forgive someone who tried to humiliate you, or would you demand justice like Ayok did? Comment below with your answer and your country. Let's see where people around the world stand on respect and accountability. It had been 1 month since that unforgettable day in court, but the world was still talking about it. Clips of Ayok's calm response, her voice steady as she faced humiliation and power abuse, had gone beyond borders. Schools used it in civics classes. Activists quoted her in rallies. Even government leaders around the world cited her words when addressing issues of police reform and respect. The story was no longer Congresswoman slapped in court. It had evolved into woman turned injustice into a global lesson. That morning, Ayok stood before the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. The hall was packed. Diplomats, journalists, and students from every corner of the planet. Flags from over 100 nations hung around the chamber, fluttering slightly in the air-conditioned breeze. As she stepped up to the podium, applause filled the room. But when she began to speak, the room fell into silence. A month ago, I stood in a courtroom not as a politician, but as a person being told to sit down and be quiet. And when I didn't, I was struck. Her words hung heavy in the air. But what struck me harder wasn't the hand. It was the realization that millions of people face the same kind of silencing every day. Without cameras, without witnesses, without justice. She paused, scanning the room. We talk about democracy as if it's built in marble, but it's built in people and how we treat each other when no one is watching. Soft murmurs filled the audience. The real victory wasn't that a police officer was punished, she continued. The real victory is that we started talking about accountability not as revenge, but as a path to respect. The hall erupted in applause. Some delegates even stood. The moment was powerful not because of grand emotion, but because of truth. When the noise died down, she smiled and added, if there's one thing that moment taught me, it's this: strength isn't standing above others, it's standing up for others. Those words were shared millions of times within hours. Stand for Others became the top global hashtag on social media. That night, Ayok returned to her hotel balcony overlooking Lake Geneva. The city lights shimmered against the water. Rena joined her, holding her phone. You've got over 500 million views on your speech already, she said. Comments are coming in from every continent. Ayok smiled softly. It's not about the views, Rena. It's about the vision. Rena laughed. That's going on a t-shirt. Ayok chuckled quietly, looking out at the horizon. Let them print it. Let them remember it. Because this isn't my story anymore. It's everyone's. The next morning, newspapers around the world ran the same headline. From the courtroom to the world stage, Ayok redefines justice. And beneath that, a quote that summed up everything she stood for. Never mistake calm for weakness. True power doesn't shout, it listens, learns, and leads. If you believe no one should ever be judged, silenced, or disrespected because of who they are, type respect in the comments. And subscribe for more inspiring stories of strength, dignity, and justice, because one voice really can change the world.